So now that we know what React Native is and what React Native apps are and what they are not, let's dive a bit deeper into that part with giving you an alternative DOM. What do I mean with that? Well, let's compare our different options. We have React for the web. We have the opportunity of building a native app for Android with just that, with Android, or the same for iOS, or we can use React Native. Now, if we build for the web, we have a div. Now, a div is really just something the browser understands. Android, iOS, they don't understand this. But we have kind of an alternative for Android, a so-called Android view. That's like a base class, a base component, which makes sense to Android basically, which also is there to wrap content in your UI, you could say. And you don't need to know the details about this, just be aware that for Android, for iOS, we of course also build UIs with components like input boxes or images, and these components simply have names, like Android view. For iOS, it would be a UI view element. So you don't need to know that, we won't use that, but that is what we would use as an alternative for a div if we were to build an app for Android or iOS. Now, we don't want to write the native code for these platforms though. And that is where React Native steps in. React Native gives us one component, the so-called view component here, and it, under the hood, knows the translations for Android and iOS. And it will translate this, when everything is compiled at the end, to these counterparts, so that we will use the view in the code we write, but it will be compiled to the two columns in the middle for Android and iOS. And that is the magic React Native does for us. And to give another example, here's an input field. Now we don't have that for Android and iOS, but for Android we have the added text component, for iOS we have UI text field, and for React Native we would have text input. Again, and that would be compiled to added text and UI text field, depending for which platform we're building. And this is how React Native works. React Native is not a replacement for the React library. The React library in its core knows how to create components and these things. It's not tied to the web, and therefore we will still use React, just as you learned it in React courses. But then we're not going to use JSX components, which are basically DOM components, DOM elements, but we're going to use the components provided by React Native. These are the components which then are compiled to native code. And React Native, as I said, also has a couple of utility functions, but this is how we use React Native and what it in the end is all about.